Good afternoon, Sean from Fuerteventura.
Good afternoon. You're not in Fuerteventura, so you're not answering from Fuerteventura. I'm from Fuerteventura, so I get the good afternoon from Fuerteventura.
Yeah.
We had a slight technical hitch, so we're having to do this a day or two later than we planned, haven't we?
So here's one for you, Sean. It's a bit of a quiz. So CNN is the bastion of the main media in the US and has been for many, many years. And I want to draw a distinction between them and what has become citizens journalism, I guess a bit like us. And here's the question. In May 24, CNN has a primetime show, which it still has. It runs for 3 hours, primetime, every day of the week. What would you guess is the aggregate viewing for the entire 7 days for the 3-hour show in primetime for CNN, May 24, the aggregate of the 7 days?
Well, it's predominantly US, millions of people, so I'd guess, 20 million.
83,000.
Wow.
Now, that is a shocking fall from grace. The reason I ask it, apart from, it's a bit of fun, is that, we're a startup. We are new citizen journalism. We're trying to get beyond the headlines and get a bit closer to what we might call truth, which is, we know is very difficult. But it just shows you that things like we're doing, we're young in it, but there's many others who are much more mature. This is where people are going to find out what is going on. And what struck me when I watched this earlier on social media is, we enjoy this, but it's more than a game. It's actually pretty serious. And it just struck me what sort of responsibility we have to do our due diligence on things before we sort of spout it on air.
No, it's a really interesting point because we haven't talked about this before we came on air, but I think it talks to the very nature of what we set out to do. I use CNN as an example. I'm not an American, but I think for years, probably decades, broadcasters are owned by, it's a business, and businessmen have beliefs, and therefore, in some respects, it's a bit like our newspapers in our country. They always talk about the Tory graph, and they talk, that they're all, and we sort of accept that. What we don't know, though, is how do you access unbiased, informed perspective on what's going on in the world? And BBC has always been, as a public service broadcaster, it's funded by the public. It's always meant to be free of that bias. Now, you and I will probably have a good ding-dong about whether it is unbiased or not. I accept that it struggles sometimes, but it is at least held accountable for any bias that it has. Whereas if you go to social media, it's the Wild West. It's an echo chamber. If you've got a view, if you don't like, for example, Donald Trump, you can find a lot of news that plays to your agenda of justifying why Donald Trump is not the right man. Whereas, how do you actually find out the truth behind some of these stories? And I think we're not big enough to assault the whole of the world. What we are trying to do is do our little bit of it, which is in the defense space, particularly around Ukraine and Israel, is to try to debunk some of these myths, try and get below some of these headlines and try and provide a much more informed perspective. It won't necessarily be right or wrong. You and I disagree about a lot of this stuff, don't we? I mean, it's not as if there's a right answer, but I do think helping inform that debate and informing it from a perspective of people who've at least got some experience, who don't particularly have an agenda here, I think you're absolutely right. That's what we're seeking to do.
Right. Sean, is this, serious question now, one of the most frightening headlines you've ever seen? And this one is from the I newspaper. So the question is, what is actually happening that we're missing?
It is very worrying, but I think part of the worry is that we've tended to see conflicts of national survival. World War II is a good example, or wars of choice, which choice tend to be far away, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran. And we've not really been warmed up to the fact that there are other levels of conflict that don't necessarily involve soldiers fighting soldiers, that they involve other ways, particularly through cyber attacks and the like. And what the head of MI5 has been saying is that we need to wake up to the fact that there are folks out there that mean us ill, and not necessarily organizations that we would naturally think to turn. I think particularly Iran, militarily, they're not that powerful. If they develop a nuclear weapon, which I think it's going to be when, not if, then clearly everybody has to take them. It changes the balance of power significantly. But in the meantime, what they're doing is they don't want to be the being bullied all the time, as they feel they are from the West. So they're doing asymmetric attacks, doing ways to undermine our authority. And what they're doing is they're capitalizing on a weakness in the West, which of course is that we have a democracy, as Churchill famously described as the least worst option of running a country.
We're very, very tolerant.
Yeah, we're very tolerant. We allow different views. We allow we have freedom of speech. We don't always like it, but we tolerate it. And I think parts of this backlash of us being so tolerant has been now seen a rise in the far right, not only in this country, but also in Europe, because people are going, hang on a minute, how do we preserve what it means to be British? And we'll go into that another week, because, I remember listening to one of our politicians say we need to be focused on what makes us British without having any idea of how to articulate it. And I think, but there is a bit of a sense, even though people in this country don't struggle to put their finger on it, that actually we're losing control. And I think this information war, how do you get to the bottom of the truth? And Iran is clearly presenting an omnipresent threat. And my bottom line in all of this is that for people in this country, they can make a decision. If they like to live in places like Iran, go ahead, fill your boots. I'd much rather live in the UK, and I'd much rather live in the UK because of the sense of values, the law, the way that our history and our heritage. Not all of it's been right. A lot of it's been, through the lens of history, but we have learned a lot. And I think you and I have talked about before, I genuinely believe you learn more from your mistakes in life than you ever do from your successes. And boy, has the British Empire made a few mistakes over the years, but it's evolved us to where we are today. And I'm very proud of that. And I think MI5 was simply giving an illustration of just how we've got to be careful that there are people out there who, away from the levels of kinetic combat, are actually still having a go at us.
And what's kinetic combat?
So fighting. So literally soldiers versus soldiers, bullets flying, artillery rounds flying. We tend to think of conflict in that way, whereas actually there are other ways that people are, through the cyber technology, undermining the freedom to vote, vote rigging, infiltrating into our media spaces. AI, I think, you're much closer to this than I, but, I think that's an area we need to explore a bit, because, there are people out there that can mimic exactly your and my characteristics, but put completely different narratives behind it. How do you know what to believe?
I think this is pretty sinister, particularly in the way you describe it. But can I just bring more of a challenge to something you said earlier about the status of Iran? And my serious question is Iran wants to be seen as a global military power. So are they a global military power, or have they just got a big mouth?
I would start off by saying I'm not a Middle East expert, but as a military guy, you study a lot of history. And I think we look at some place like Iran as being through the same lens as being British. So we understand the British Isles, we understand that we're an island nation, we understand that we all speak the same language, culture, whatever. If you look at Iran isn't quite the same. Iran is a huge country, but it is a whole load of different ethnic groups, different sort of religious beliefs, militants and the like. And actually, how on earth you govern an organization like a country like that is actually very difficult, very, very difficult. And, we sometimes the way that people govern that is through a series of laws or brutally, frankly, that we don't subscribe to in the West. And I think that Saddam Hussein is a really good example of this, because we didn't like the way he ran Iraq. We thought it's brutal, thought it's a dictator. So we effectively severed the head. We got rid of him. But actually, he put he was a pressure cooker. He kept the lid on it. As soon as you took that lid off, it erupted. And I do think we've got to be very careful about judging other parts of the world where, the dynamics are very, very different. And Iran, I think, traditionally in the Middle East, they pick fights with their enemies to try to galvanize their own country. And I think that's what Iraq used to do. I think that's what Iran does but Iran, the leadership of Iran is not guaranteed. They have a huge standing army to protect them. There's a lot of oil flying around. So there's a lot of money. There's a lot of reasons for people to be in power because, corruption can be rife. It's not like this country where we have to, generate work, generate employment, generate taxes to generate income to be able to look up. Places like Iraq and Iran, they generate huge revenues just from oil.
Mm-hmm. So the reason I asked the question is there's been a lot of word on the street recently that Iran has spent the last many years where the sanctions have been softened a bit. As you said and implied, they've been earning significant amounts of money through natural resources, oil being one of the primary ones. And the word on the street is that they've been spending that money on getting ready for a war with the West. And what apparently they've done is they've built their infrastructure, their warfighting infrastructure, below ground and very, very well protected. Plus, they've equipped themselves with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of missiles and other things. And we've seen some of the evidence of that. If that were true, then that would be actually quite worrying, and maybe that would justify the fact they've decided to put their head above the parapet. What do you think? I mean, have you heard these stories? And if so, what's your view?
Let's be clear. I think the ruling of any party of any country, a first priority is to protect its people. Now, whether they mean the people or protect their own regime is, subject of discussion. But creating the ability to protect yourself, and I think if you are not as powerful as your enemy, you have to think of different ways of protecting yourself and of attacking. So Hamas has been a great example of this in Gaza because they're no match for the Israelis. But what they've done is they've done massive tunnel networks from which they can pop out and, like whack-a-mole, attack the Israelis. And I think you have to think of asymmetric ways. So for Iran, they know America's got massive bunker-busting bombs. So you need to just build your facilities even further underground, or into mountains. Some of their facilities for the nuclear capability actually be into the sides of mountains, just making it really, really difficult for anybody to target your capability. And I think that's where some of this, because let's be clear, Iran with money can buy lots of kit and equipment, but most of it's old kit and equipment. Most of it, Russia provides most of it. And as we've seen in the war in Ukraine, even under Russian use with more modern weapons, Russia has struggled to make it work against, old Western kit. So Iran's looking at this going, we've got to have a game changer. The only game changer we can get is nuclear weapons, because if we had nuclear weapons, that would put a really big seed down in the West. And despite the sanctions, despite everything else, if we dig everything deep underground or into mountains, huge cost, but frankly, we've got lots of money. It's not difficult for us to throw our oil money at that. We can now keep it out of sight, out of mind, and eventually we will get a nuclear weapon. And when we do, suddenly we're no longer the small kid on the block. We're the big kid. We've got a big stick. And that, I think, will be a much more worrying time. So I'm less concerned about the rockets and the missiles, the bombs. Ultimately, China, Russia, they love parading their stuff on a street. That doesn't mean Russia's any good when it comes to war, because military equipment does not equal military capability. You need to have properly trained people, doctrine, logistics, and everything else. And a lot of these Middle East countries don't have that. So I'm less worried about the front of house, but the nuclear question does worry me because it's binary. You either have it or you don't.
Okay, then, so the net of that is they've got a big mouth, and that's not unknown. When Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait, George Bush Sr. got involved. He put, what's his first name?
Norman
Schwarzkopf. And Saddam Hussein famously said, if you attack me, I promise you the mother of all battles. And it fizzled out pretty quickly. So, okay, I guess, back to the first question, that may be true in Iran itself, but they seem to have discovered a way of very sinister means of infiltrating societies, and that may be, more worrying. Can we just stand back a bit and look at the Middle East as a whole? We've talked about, is this going to explode into a regional conflict? What I saw the other day is that Saudi, Qatar, UAE, Bahrain, and Kuwait have all stood up and declared neutrality. In other words, in maybe the Iran proxy wars that are going on, they've decided to stand back and say we're supporting nobody. Just the question is, why would they do that, Sean?
I think it's been a bit of a masterstroke, to be honest, because so one of the things we talked a bit about the Israel conflict is that it's made life very uncomfortable for both of us, but me particularly, because you try and provide an objective view. There is a view from the Israelis. You're either with us or you're against us. And if you're faced with that binary choice for a lot of the Middle East countries, you're either for Iran or against Iran. That's not a position that they can comfortably take. Now, over the years, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, a number of countries of the Middle East have gradually become more and more westernized. They still are now. So, for example, Saudi is still custodians of the Holy Faith. They look after Mecca. There's huge responsibilities on Saudi Arabia's shoulders to be at the vanguard of what it means to be part of the Islamic faith and Islam. And they can't abandon that. If they took the side of the West in a conflict against Iran, that would create fissures in their society, which would be incredibly damaging. So what they've very cleverly done is said, hang on a minute, what binds us in the Middle East with you, Iran, is the Muslim faith, and we take that very seriously. But if you want to pick a fight with somebody else, that's got nothing to do with us. And therefore, we don't want it to compromise our relations with the West or our relations with you. I think if you look at it from as you said, step back, if you step far enough back, part of the issue of this is all blown up, let's remind ourselves, is about Israel and about Gaza, is that Israel, when it was formed just at the end of the Second World War, everybody around it, all the Islamic countries around, sort of invaded because they went, we don't want this here. Over time, gradually that approach has softened. To the east, Jordan has accommodated, then Egypt accommodated. Saudi Arabia is on the verge of recognizing Israel as well. But Iran absolutely does not want this. And I think over time, we've seen, it's not a shift to the West, but a more accommodation. If you remember, I worked in Saudi Arabia, a decade ago, and it was still relatively uncomfortable for Westerners, very uncomfortable for women there. But it's changed enormously over such a short period of time. And I think the whole Middle East is evolving at pace. It doesn't mean they're going to abandon their faith, and I think that's absolutely appropriate. But in terms of values, in terms of equality, freedom of speech, stuff like that, gradually these countries are evolving. That is not something that's comfortable for Iran. And I think, therefore, it was, in a way, it was a masterstroke that just said diplomatically, absolutely, we stand with you, Iran, for all sorts of reasons. But this conflict, that's your bailiwick. It's nothing to do with us.
Okay, here's a headline to get below, Sean. Turkish troops arrive in Lebanon. Now, it might be true, but of course the message it's trying to give is that something quite serious has actually happened.
Yeah, and it goes back to why we formed Red Matrix, doesn't it, really? It's, I saw these headlines and thought, oh, holy shimoly, what's happening? Is Turkey being dragged into the war? But of course, inevitably, get behind the headlines and you find there's a few other things going on. First of all, one of the articles I read, it implied that Turkey thought that Israel was trying to expand its borders and they eventually would therefore become a threat to Turkey. If you look at it geographically, for Israel to do that, it would have to work its way through Lebanon, then it would have to work its way through Syria, and then it would end up on the door of Turkey. Do you really think that's likely? I mean, I can't see that at all. But I think if you get to the core of it, Israel's fight is with Hamas, but it's the Palestinians that have taken the brunt of the carnage. It's wrecked communities. It's killed 42,000 people, we understand so far, injured well over 100,000. And therefore, if you were to choose sides, Turkey is predominantly as Islamic faith country, and therefore it probably sides more with the Palestinians than it does with Israel. And given that Erdogan's a politician, he has to reflect his country's view. Therefore, he's likely to be more, supportive of the Palestinian side, not Hamas, but the Palestinian side. The interesting thing for me is, of course, it's the dichotomy that Turkey is a member of NATO and therefore uses the umbrella of NATO, but actually it's part of the Islamic community. Now, is that a blocker to being a member of NATO? No, of course it's not, but it does create some frictions along the way. And the final bit of this story, which I think for me is the heart of it, is that, without giving you a history lesson, but at the south of the Lebanon, after the last war in 2006, when a peace deal was agreed, the Litani River, Hezbollah had to move north of that. The blue line, which wasn't a border, but it was a sort of line of withdrawal, Israelis had to move south of that. And the buffer zone between was only to be patrolled by United Nations forces and the Lebanon. Who is a member of that United Nations force? Turkey. So Turkey, quite understandably, can rotate troops into that position. That puts them in an uncomfortable position in the front line at the moment. And whilst we don't have time on this to go into it, bluntly, there's been an abject failure of the United Nations in that region to actually enforce the deal that was done. It was United Nations 1701. It was a deal that north, south, buffer zone, and almost as soon as the ink was dry on that, the Hezbollah moved in, and the United Nations should have stopped that. They didn't. As a result, that's led to a great deal of frustration from Israel that they were not able to enforce the agreement that Israel signed up to.
Actually, Turkey did actually put 100 troops in, but the reason was quite innocent.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to, the very point you and I, outside of this podcast, we end up having some pretty animated conversations about this stuff, don't we? Because you absolutely hold me to account that says, yeah, Sean, you're very well informed, but it doesn't make you right. And you're absolutely right. But what we try and do is provide a little bit more context to some of these headlines so that people could form their own view. We're not on the ground, but as you say, 100 troops going to the front line from Turkey has a very different connotation than what I think is actually happening on the ground.
Yeah, quite. Well, here's one which I think you probably could use fake news about. Benjamin Netanyahu, he was landing in his plane, gets off his plane, an Iranian missile lands somewhere close. There's a lot of collateral damage. Benjamin Netanyahu ends up with serious head injuries. This makes, in as much as it was a headlines in social media, the commentary from people was just awful. Can this be true? What's going to happen? Is he going to die? I mean, people obviously, with limited time, took it seriously.
I think ever since we've managed to communicate, Second World War, the newspapers used to carry stories in them back to the British public that were weeks out of date, but often trying to raise morale. And I think sometimes the motives for these sorts of headlines often, if you're a Palestinian, if you're a member of Hamas, if you're a member of Iran, you'd want to sow the seeds of these sorts of stories because it undermines support. Because if you were an Israeli Defense Forces fighter and you're not going to be comfortable because a lot of them are dying at the moment, if you now know that Benjamin Netanyahu's been killed, or you might change your motivations around fighting. So there's lots of reasons why sometimes these stories can abound. If they were emanating from, as you said, the CNN or BBC or some organization has, I'll be careful what I say here, a degree of credibility. I'm not saying a degree of credibility. Then if they're proved wrong, that does damage their credibility. And most organizations don't want that to happen. So they try to make sure these stories have some background. In this particular case, there's no evidence whatsoever I can find it's true. What I can find is that there was a bit of news that showed Benjamin Netanyahu's, the headline said, scurrying away in fear under an Iranian missile attack. And you went, okay. And I looked at the footage and went, there is almost certainly Netanyahu. He's almost certainly in a light jog. He's on the phone and he's clearly underground somewhere. Then you're looking to go, okay, if you're a senior military guy or a senior politician, you're going to be a target. You have a responsibility to stay alive. I have several friends who live in Israel. And whenever there's an attack, they go into their concrete bunker underground. There's no doubt Netanyahu, he hasn't been the most popular leader out there, and I'm sure he is a target. Therefore, if he comes under attack, there's a body of people who will rush him quickly to the concrete bunker to look after him. Does that mean he's running scared of Iran? Does that mean, in some way he's lost his bottle? I don't think he has at all. I mean, it's just, I remember doing that sort of thing when I was on operations. You have a duty to protect yourself, particularly if you're going to be a target. So I do think that sometimes we try and join the dots that there's Netanyahu's running for cover. Oh, now he's been hit and he's lost half his brain, he's popped out and he's now, unable to run the place. Okay. And again, I think it goes back to, we're going to do a few more of these, I think, aren't we, over the time? And you and I will not always agree, but what we will agree is that we want to ensure the audience applies a little bit of intellectual rigor to these things. That if you see a story that looks untrue, then it probably is. Try and get a bit more behind it, because there are ways on the internet to explore. And what we're doing is using a lot of grey hair or bald to bring a little bit of perspective to some of these stories.
No, I mean, thank you, Sean, for pointing that out. Not the bit about the story, the bit about my hair. I like it a bit. Thank you. I appreciate it. When should you get home?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks.
So let's bring the Israeli Middle East conflict right home to here in the United Kingdom. We've got the countries in the Middle East declaring neutrality. And I think your explanation is really good, sort of credible. Starmer, the leader of the UK and leader of the Labour Party, has stood up and said, we stand with Israel. Jeremy Corbyn, who's still around, having for 2 elections got a lot more votes than Keir Starmer when Jeremy Corbyn actually lost, has said, no, we don't. And somewhere in the middle, you've got Lammy, Foreign Secretary, saying we support them, but he's chopped 10% of the support off. I don't know why. Maybe he's trying to appease to a local audience. How do you interpret that? And what do you think these politicians are actually trying to do?
It's a tricky one, this. So I'm sure we will attract a bit of, criticism for even having a go at this. The problem with somewhere like the Israel conflict is that it polarizes opinion. You're either for one side or you're against them. And the problem is 7th of October was a horrendous act. Hamas did despicable things. They should be held to account. That was an awful chapter in the relationship, the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. So I don't think anybody with anywhere in the civilized world would think that would be anything but atrocious, and the atrocities were awful. But as a military guy, the conflict didn't start on the 7th of October. It started the day that Israel was formed. And it's very difficult not to look at what happened that day in the context of everything else that was out there. And it isn't a binary world. When I was younger, everything was black and white. Now there's a lot more shades of grey out in these things. And in my assessment, I think a lot of the historical commentators, the political commentators, if you look at the situation, Israel is absolutely entitled to its self-defense. But there is also quite a lot that's been going on around the Middle East about their handling of Gaza for the last 40, 50 years, the handling of the West Bank for that time. And bluntly, even Israel admits that it's doing a lot of stuff that's illegal in the West Bank. And I think the problem is that we as a country have politically jumped straight to the black and white. So we've said, right, we fully support Israel, and the immediate aftermath of those attacks, I understand that. The danger is, does that give Netanyahu a blank check to do whatever he likes in the Gaza? I think, I speak for a number of people who get more uncomfortable with the level of civilian casualties that resulted, more uncomfortable with the lack of a political plan for what happens later. And, military action only ever achieves the conditions to allow a political solution to prevail. That is in Netanyahu's hands, and yet he's not articulating what that looks like. The danger, therefore, as a military guy, it looks like he's acting out of anger rather than actually trying to solve the problem. And that, for me, is very difficult. So I think transposing that into the political environment back at home, now you've got Prime Minister who doesn't want to say anything other than I fully support Israel. The marches that happen, although originally the marches were hate marches, they were awful. But actually, a lot of people are coming out simply in sympathy with the Palestinians. There are still elements of those that are hate, and I deplore that unconditionally. But it does talk to, there's a part of our society that is uncomfortable with what's happening to the Palestinian people in the absence of having a plan as to where all this is going. And of course, Corbyn speaks to that very conversation. And I think it's incredibly difficult that, and I don't think we want to, or, you have rightly criticized me. No, you've observed that because I am not pro-Israel, therefore I might sound pro-Palestinian. I genuinely am not. But I absolutely also am not fully behind what I think that Israel's doing, for the reasons I've just articulated, but primarily as an ex-military guy, that it pains me to see the casualties, the impacts of war, both on communities, on people, on livelihoods, and on families, if that isn't a necessary price to achieve an end state. What is that? I mean, do you know what the end state is? Do you know what Netanyahu's trying to achieve here?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah.
Well, in fact, I do. I actually know the answer to that question, Sean. It won't be a good one for you. I'm not saying it is for me either. I don't think Netanyahu has thought beyond the elimination of Hamas and maybe the elimination of Hezbollah, the Houthis, the terrorist element in Syria, et cetera, et cetera. It feels a bit like the Twin Towers. We got to do two things. We've got to stand up to our local people to say that we're not going to be kicked around, and secondly, we're full of revenge. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but that's what I think the objective is. And obviously, now that the war against Hamas is, potentially coming to a close, not the war with Gaza, because as you've said before, that's going to go on and on. People are now beginning to ask that reasonable question: is what we do now? And I think it's actually pretty difficult.
But if you don't answer that question, not you, but rhetorically, if one doesn't answer that question, the whole purpose of the military campaign is what?
Well, so I can't speak as the military guy, because I wasn't one. You were, but I think if somebody's going to chuck rocks at you, and you remove all their rocks, and you cut off the arm that's throwing the rocks, you could argue you've done your job. They can't throw rocks at you anymore. You go, yeah, but what's going to happen to him? He hasn't got an arm. Well, that's not my problem. It's somebody else's problem. I'm not saying that's right, by the way, but from Netanyahu's point of view, that's what I think he would say.
Yes, but I think one of the flaws in that argument is that in this particular example, is it possible to eliminate Hamas? Is it possible to eliminate Hezbollah? And the answer is blatantly no. You can definitely degrade their ability to fight at the moment, maybe for the next month, maybe for the next year, maybe for the next 5 years. But if you have left an environment of visceral hatred behind, that is a petri dish for the next generation of hatred, and it will come back to bite you. So, I reiterate that one of the things I'm not saying earlier now, I mean, let's be really clear. One of the frustrations around my experience in Afghanistan was that, we went into Afghanistan with pretty clearly on the back of President Bush's coattails, because 9/11 had happened. We need revenge, the word you used, and we're going to schwack the people who did that. And largely we did. The problem is then our presence out there evolved into a nation-building agenda for Afghanistan. Put a McDonald's on every street corner, give women the vote, and peace will prevail. Well, we've never been good at nation-building, and with the absence of having that political will, we ended up leaving Afghanistan with our tail between our legs. So we're not good at it in this country either. But when you are going to war, there should be really clear political engagement and responsibility. And we're just not good at that. We're not good at that in the West. We think too short term. This is grand strategy. And I think the worry is that Netanyahu, for exactly the reasons you've articulated, feels that he can take revenge. He feels he's tapping into that, the vibe in the country that is that just is had enough of Hezbollah, Hamas, and is going to be triumphant. And they will have their day. I have no doubt they will have their day. But I confidently predict that in 10 years or 20 years' time, they will get a very bloody nose as a result of the seeds of discontent that have been laid as a result of the actions today.
Well, you said a minute ago that the war didn't start on the 7th of October, and never a true word was said, Sean, because actually the war between Israel and the countries and nations and people that surround it has been going on for thousands of years. So, I mean, maybe 3, 4, 5,000 years, going right back to days where we do have actually pretty good records as well, surprisingly. So if somebody says it's going to go on for another 5,000, I go, yeah, probably. And I think the other dimension, which we're going to have to deal with as a world, is there's going to be a huge number of displaced people in Gaza or from Gaza. Let's call them refugees. And where are they going to go? And what appears to be bubbling at the moment is a number of the other countries around there who've got a lot of history with Palestinians being in their country and then not being in their country. A lot of countries around them are saying, well, no, actually, we're not having them. And I mean, Egypt is doubling the size of its, prevention. How's the Middle East and indeed the wider world are going to deal with that?
No, and I think one of the things we touched on before is that, again, to be blunt, you and I are not going to be able to solve the Middle East country. I'm not arrogant enough to believe I have any of the answers. What I absolutely believe, though, is that a constant cycle of violence is not going to solve it. And I think if you look back in history, the closest we got was Yasser Arafat, and I think it was President Clinton, and there was the peace accords that were signed or whatever. A bit like our experience in Northern Ireland, you're never going to solve it day one, but charting a course through which gradually the wounds heal over time, through generations. Gradually you wash through that. The families must want a better life. Palestinians must be tired of this constant round of violence. They want hope, they want prosperity. And it's been like Ireland, you're not going to change the fundamental arguments, but do the communities just tire of this constant round? And for me, one of the ingredients that's always been missing is that that iconic picture of the Israeli president, the PLO leader, Yasser Arafat, and President Clinton looking like they've agreed a deal. But that would only work if America was independent. And as we've seen blatantly over the last year particularly, America is not independent. America is a staunch backer of Israel, is the ultimate guarantor for Israel, and therefore Yasser Arafat in that picture is the outsider, he's the interloper, he doesn't belong. And how can you sell a deal to Palestinians when it looks like he's been bullied into it? You've got to have somebody else. You've got to have the US president, in other words, the grown-up on the side of Israel. And where's the grown-up on the side of the Palestinians? And how do they help? Almost certainly has to be Saudi Arabia, particularly because to rebuild Gaza is going to require a hell of a lot of money. In the past, the Middle East countries have helped, but they have to be part of a political solution. It has to be people in addition to the US, because otherwise it's going to look like a solution imposed on the region, and that looks like a Western imposed solution, an Israeli sponsored solution, and that ain't going to work.
So would it be true to say that for the people of Gaza to build a country from what they have, call it Palestine, call it something else maybe, they have to get rid of Hamas?
Well, I'd probably look at it the other way around, is that Hamas is probably an inevitable outcome of the situation they find themselves, because they don't have any hope. The Palestinian people don't have, and therefore, it's grown as a result of their frustrations. If you can chart a course to a better future, then organizations like Hamas would never be able to gain traction, because they'd be seen as a mechanism to go back to the dark ages. It's a little bit like the IRA in Ireland. Eventually, you either have to be part of the political process, or you resigned on the graveyard of history. And so rather than focusing on we've got to get rid of Hamas is an inevitability whilst you have the situation where they have no hope. And I think, therefore, yes, but rather than focusing on just getting rid of Hamas, actually tackle the reasons why Hamas has flourished. And I think that's where the political efforts, and as you and I have discussed before, our politicians are so short-term that they aren't prepared to commit the really difficult work to finding a way to resolve this. And I'm not saying it's easy. I absolutely recognize there's some deep-rooted difficulties, but if we seem not to have the appetite to engage, and if we don't, we're going to be destined to repeat this cycle of violence again and again. It may take a few years, because I think Israel's probably done quite a good job of stamping out most of Hamas, stamping out a good proportion of command and control and Hezbollah. Have they got rid of it? Absolutely not.
Okay, so if I interpret what you've said to sort of simplify it, maybe unfairly, Sean, what you're saying is, or what you're postulating, is that Hamas exists as a terrorist organization because of the ill will from Israel to the people, and treatment from Israel to the people of Gaza. So it's an inevitable response to Israel's actions. That's a body of opinion. There'd be another body of opinion, is that actually Hamas, as a proxy for Iran, their goal is to eradicate Israel. It's got nothing to do with the people of Gaza, for whom they've never spent any money on, and therefore don't care. Their goal is to get rid of Israel, and therefore that makes it a completely different conflict. And it seems to me that the world is stuck in those two positions. And I don't know how you fix it without finding some, dare I say it, common ground.
I'm agreeing with you. I think those two positions can coexist. I think if the Palestinian people feel that they have no hope, they vote in an organization, which they did. They voted in Hamas into power. And Hamas said, try different ways to improve the quality of life for Palestinian people, but none of that worked. And gradually, they think the only way to capture the attention of the international community, through which gradually, Israel's gradual incursions into the West Bank and the like can gradually be stopped. And they've chosen a path which is horrendous. But there is a view that says that that's being done to try to stem Israel's push out. And I absolutely agree with the line that those sympathizers with the Palestinians, sympathizers with Hamas, like Iran, would go, well, actually, unless something changes over time, Israel's gradually going to push out all the Palestinians from the West Bank, gradually going to make life untenable for everybody in Gaza. And therefore, what does Iran do to try to stop that? So it's a chicken and egg argument, isn't it? Which comes first? And the danger is, I'm not here to decide which comes first. I think that you end up with a system that, exactly as you say, if you take sides in it, it's easy to blame the other side. The point is that isn't going to get us to some form of solution. Somehow they've got to navigate their way that the Palestinians, as well as the Israelis, have a right to hope. They have a right to prosperity. They have a right to education. They have a right to a prosperous future. How on earth do you navigate the way to that? Because if you don't, the path they've taken is just horrendous, just horrible.
It's an interesting conversation, isn't it? You use Northern Ireland as an example with some similarities. The IRA, the military wing, you had the political wing, Sinn Féin. I think everybody would agree to that statement. Well, not everybody maybe, but most people. In the end, the IRA disarmed. Pretty much 99%. There's still the old little thing going on. But they largely disarmed, and it became a political thing. So if we're saying Hamas can do that, disarm and join the political process, which would mean, other parts of the environment taking a big gulp of air to give that some chance of surviving, then, maybe there's hope. But if Hamas continues to be led by Iran, which you discussed earlier in the show, have got other very sinister objectives, then, maybe, it's sort of beyond hope in terms of locally.
No, I don't disagree with that at all. I mean, I've said before, the more I know about the Middle East, the more I realize I don't know. And, in terms of people watching or people's own views, I suspect most people don't have as much time to spend analyzing it as we do, certainly as I do. It doesn't make me right, and absolutely, but it's trying to give an indication that this is more than a football match. You've got to back one side or the other. That if you're on the side of humanity rather than the side of Israelis or Palestinians, I think there is another path there. And politically, that's why it's such a difficult job. But just saying it's difficult means people just walk away from it, and we're not going to.
Yeah, I agree. Totally, I agree. We'll put you in charge, Sean. That's what I'm there for. That's what I'm there for. Sean, we spent a lot of time talking about the conflict in the Middle East, rightly so. It has rather bumped the war between Russia and Ukraine off the front pages, but there actually have been some pretty significant developments, haven't there?
They have. We'll come back to the news this week because President Zelensky's been doing his round of a victory plan. But the odd bits of the news, though, it's really interesting. It's now polarized into two different reports of the news in Ukraine. On one side, there's lots of reports of Russian oil terminals bursting into flames. The last one was Feodosia. It's an oil terminal just off the coast of Crimea. And with the Russians denying it's been attacked, but agreeing that it's in flames, Ukraine, cheering because they've actually managed to target more of Russian oil, which of course, all of which damages its chance to earn revenue. Now, on that side, I think Ukraine has been quite effective with its probably homemade drones. They're going long distances. They're able to produce a lot of them so they can swamp the Russian defenses. Although Russian, I have no doubt, shoots a lot of them down. It does seem that some are getting through. But it's part of that whole thing because, frankly, whilst it's interesting to see how Ukraine can, nibble away like wasps at a picnic at Russia, that's not going to be decisive. Whereas on the battlefield, which is where the main war is fighting in the Donbass, Russia has been grinding forward. And in the last week, we've heard that Volodar has fallen. Now, Volodar was one of those towns that was fought over before the war started. There were aspirations by Russia to take it on. It's been 2.5 years being protected, and we understand it's now fallen. Now, that strategically is quite important. It's important because it isn't a major breakthrough. This isn't Russia suddenly, the cracks in the dam has fallen, Russia's piling in. But what it does show is that Russia is still inching towards its objective of securing the Donbass region, which most military analysts believe that's what Putin's revised objectives for this campaign are. And there's been another interesting piece by the MOD this week, and I think it was one of the US think tanks that said that Russia has been suffering the highest casualties since the start of the war these last 2 months. Now, that's not sustainable because they're not managing to recruit people. But I think it just demonstrates Russia is really pushing everything it's got this summer on the basis that when it comes to the winter, can't do much fighting. What else is happening this winter? US elections. What happens if President Trump gets in? He keeps saying, I'll solve this in 24 hours.
Yeah.
Thinking, let's get the negotiation in advance of that.
Yeah. In other words, what I've got, I keep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it feels by your description that another little piece of a jigsaw has been put into place by Putin to build the picture that he ultimately may want to settle on. Yeah,
and that's the worry. I think we're inching towards, What's unfortunate is this side of the presidential election, there's almost strategic paralysis when it comes to foreign policy. I don't think we're going to hear any, big muscle movements from America until the election's out of the way. Mainly because I suspect that, if you're Kamala Harris, you're not going to want to say we're going to provide X amount of money, because Trump would leap on that and go, I'd spend that on taxpayers, and it will prove very divisive. And given it's such a tight race, I don't think we're going to hear any big announcements around Ukraine. What I hope is that once the election is out of the way, if it is a Trump presidency, we'll start to better understand what his approach to Ukraine is, good or bad. And likewise, if Kamala Harris prevails, then at least I'm pretty sure we'll hear quickly what that means. In the meantime, going back to your point, President Zelensky is still doing a round of talks with European leaders. He's presenting this victory plan. We're still no closer to understanding, what that entails. But I am hearing more and more jungle drums. So if you wind the clock back a year, if we'd even talked about a negotiated end to this conflict, I'd be pilloried by Ukrainian people saying, don't give up. We're going to win. We're going to get rid of Russia. We've been fighting for 300 years. They don't stand a chance. They just don't realize it yet. There's definitely I wouldn't say a change, but a mood swing, that there is more of a war weariness going on now. There's more of a sense that, is ultimate victory still within our grasp? And even if it was, how many years, decades, what price, what cost? Is there a different way of navigating your way to the end of this conflict? And in a binary world, yes, they're not saying Ukraine's ready to give up, but is there a slight shift from we're not going to talk to maybe talk? There's definitely a sense of that out there.
And maybe they're going to have to redefine victory.
And I think that may be what the victory plan is about, is if victory means Russia's out of Ukraine completely, I'm not sure that's an easy outcome to achieve. If victory means an end of the war, if victory means that you secure financial support to rebuild your country, if victory means that you could finally put an end to this 300 years of Russia threat to your country and have a guarantee of security into the immediate and medium term, many would argue that if you can find a way of stopping this 300-year war, then that would be victory. But I re-emphasize, I risk putting words into it's conjecture, because I don't know what it contains. But President Zelensky's not stupid, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if part of this is navigating the way to ensuring a vibrant and prosperous Ukraine, secure in its borders, whatever those borders look like. Is that something a bit like the Winter War, Finland, the Winter War? Is that what he's
angling for?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, look, I've got one final question for you. We're going to finish this show with a very similar question to the one we started. Not same area, but similar type of thing. And before we do that, and before we leave Ukraine, I gather some more F-16s have arrived. Have they got the planes actually there? Have they got the pilots?
Well, again, there's not much advertising around this. My understanding is that on Monday, more F-16s arrived. It's worth remembering that the West has pledged, I think, just north of 80 F-16s. But if they all were delivered, first of all, they'd be a target for Russia. Secondly, Ukrainians just don't have the pilots to fly that number of F-16s yet. They're all going through various training programs and language training and the like. So there'll be little point in putting 85 F-16s on the ground into Ukraine. What I do understand is that as more of the pilots come out of the very swift training system, that obviously you need more and more F-16s available for them to fly. We also understand that one F-16 was lost to friendly fire, tragically, earlier, shortly after their arrival. So it shouldn't be a great surprise that the tap allowing F-16s in will be constantly drip feeding in. But the real challenge, I think, is as ever, and will be for some decades probably, is pilots. I think the other thing about F-16s, though, that's interesting is that at the start of the war, we said there was no chance of a no-fly zone by the West getting involved. I'm starting to hear a little bit more about the potential for, on the western side of Ukraine, so there's no risk of attacking Russian radars and surface-to-air missile systems on Russian territory, but providing a degree of sanctuary in the west of the country using a no-fly zone potentially manned by Western assets. Nothing more than a talking point. There's absolutely no policy around that as yet, but all of a sudden starting to hear, and I think part of this is, how much support do we provide Ukraine? Anti-tank weapons, then it became tanks, then it became long-range missiles, then it became F-16s. What's the next thing that the West could consider? And I'm hearing more and more that might be something. And I think it's something we should discuss. We should get a couple of guests in to try to flush that out to see what they think.
Right, here comes the final question. What I'm going to do, I'm going to get my little friend on camera. I'm babysitting this afternoon. This is a 5-week-old little kitten. Called Sunday. And my new wife brought a cat with her, and we decided that we'd better get another little cat. It was easier to get a kitten so they could become friends. And it's just woken up. So rather than her making a noise meowing everywhere, I've decided to give her a bit more love while we finish the show. Hello.
Oh.
Right, my final question. Am I going to regret picking this cat up? Probably. So, the US has committed $60 billion to the Ukraine war. The question is, where does that money go? Now, I'm going to mention Kennedy's name. Last time I did that, I got beaten up by people saying, well, yeah, what does he know? But this is his kind of theory. So the 60 billion actually doesn't go to Ukraine. It goes to Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, the US military industry base. They then sell that 60 billion, ignoring how you get to 60 billion, because in reality it might be a lot less, but 60 billion sort of top sales cost terms. They then sell $60 billion worth to Ukraine. Ukraine then have a debt. The American economy has had a $60 billion input. Jobs, local industry supporting it, supply chains, the whole lot. At some stage, Ukraine going to have to pay that back. That's another $60 billion. That's $120 billion. So 2 + 2 = 6, maybe even a bit more. What's your take, Sean?
It's one of those difficulties. I mean, it's very difficult to answer a serious question with you cuddling a 6-week-old little kid, I have to say. But that's no. I mean, I think it's part of the realities of war, isn't it? I mean, you understandably. So when I was in the MOD, one of the frustrations was that if we wanted to buy let's suppose it was a submarine, and for effect, if we wanted to buy this country, it's going to cost 100 million. If we wanted to buy it from overseas, it was 70 million, because there'd be somebody out there willing to sell it 70 million. You say, well, we were incentivized to go and buy the 70 million one. Whereas actually, if you buy the 100 million one in this country, because the way that you apply employment, people pay taxes, there's an economic model that says that about 40 plus pence in every pound, it's recycled back into the economy. So for every pound you spend, you only actually spend just under 60p. So it would be far more beneficial for us as a nation to buy stuff ourselves than buy overseas. But the MOD wasn't incentivized to do that. As a result, we would end up having to buy stuff from overseas. Doesn't make sense. Returning to your point about the war, I think the problem is that industry has always, the share price have always gone up whenever there is wars around, because the defense industries make a lot of money out of it. They provide a lot of employment, and also it helps. So in this particular case, the US, if you put a lot of money through Lockheed Martin, a proportion of that money goes to R&D. So they are developing the next generation of weapons. So the whole irony of this is that, they will benefit. But that, in a way, is part of the sort of capitalist society within which we live, isn't it? It is, would Ukraine be able to get the weapons if they didn't go to a huge company like Lockheed Martin that was able to provide them? It's also, let's be really clear as well. We in this country, we've talked about storm shadows. We book them as the cost it cost us, and that's how much we've been generous to give Ukraine. In reality, those storm shadows were near the end of their life. Were they really worth that much money? There's the politicians trying to make a big thing of it. But yeah, there's the headline: does this deal with America, 60 billion? Not all of it goes to Lockheed, but there's a good proportion of it. It does. Does that benefit the US as well as benefiting Ukraine? Yes, it does. If, and it's a big if, but if Ukraine is charged the 60 billion that the US invested, then America effectively makes a profit out of the deal. That sounds distasteful to me, but because I'm not aware, what I am aware in this country is we have given a lot of capability to Ukraine, but what we are doing is now going, when the barrel is empty, how do we use money to generate more capability? One of those ways is we just publicly fund it. Another way is, as they're doing in Europe, they've frozen all of assets that Russia had, the interest that's being paid, we use the interest of that to pay for some of these weapons to go out. Does the industries that make those weapons benefit? Yes. Does it make them more profitable? Yes. Is that a bad thing? Not necessarily, if that's the way to get the weapons into Ukraine. So again, it's another good example of, I think it's right that we highlight it, but we probably want to explore a bit further as to if the only aid that America was giving was 60 billion of aid, and all of that went to Lockheed Martin, and Ukraine suddenly found itself owing 60 billion, that I think would be a really interesting story. That's not the understanding of how it actually works. But you're absolutely right. It's an interesting one.
Yeah. Okay, Sean. Well, it's Friday. It's goodbye from me. It's goodbye from Sunday. Sitting on my lap now. And
yeah, goodbye from me. And it's been a pleasure to join again. I think one of the things we're going to do more of, and we want to get more people to engage in this. What are some of those stories that we need to have a look at? Not solve, but have a look at, because we want to get behind some of these and help provide a more informed perspective.
Right.